Welcome to Voices Against Violence, a Harmony House podcast to educate, empower, and serve as a voice for survivors. We aim to shed light on crucial issues surrounding domestic violence, offer support, and inspire action for change. Join us as we work together to create a community where all individuals can live a life free of abuse.
Hi, I'm Kirstyn Walker. I am the Assistant Executive Director at Harmony House.
Charity Jordan Rex, Prevention Program Manager for Harmony House. And today, Kirstyn and I are talking about trauma.
Clear the schedule, Charity. You have tapped into my favorite thing to talk about.
I don't know if I'd say it's my favorite thing, but it is a soapbox that I am willing to get on anytime, anywhere.
Great.
Because we do not talk about this enough in our society. We don't have systems set up to help people with trauma. And so many of the issues that we see in society and the struggles that people have can be traced back to trauma. I feel like that we need a law that says you cannot be elected to office if you have not gone through some trauma-informed training.
Wow.
Think about,
I would sign that petition.
Think about if our legislators were trauma informed and they were making policy from a trauma informed. Okay.
Could you imagine? Now I will say I have had the pleasure of meeting some legislators who are social workers, and what a phenomenal background before you become an elected official.
Yeah.
Wow. Anyway.
I mean, okay. I'm like, my brain is racing because there's so many things. I'm going to let you take the lead because this is like, you used to train on this and other roles. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about what is trauma.
What is trauma? Now, yes. So I did used to train on this. This is a topic that I could talk on and on and on about. So in those trainings, I would open it up to maybe 30 people in a training, and I'd say, how would you define trauma? And I could have gotten 30 different answers. And it's a word that we use kind of regularly.
We use it a lot. We use a lot of mental health language.
We sure do.
And kind of trivial. We kind of trivialized it.
Yeah.
I'm digressing here, but I'm kind of torn on that because on the one hand, it's like using that language, people are somewhat familiar. Like we're normalizing talking about it.
Sure.
But on the other hand, it's like we're not using these terms correctly.
And does that make it harder then when we want to have conversations of trauma and then we've got confusion about what trauma is? Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's as people get more familiar with these topics and terms, we're going to hear them more often in our regular language and sometimes not the way that they are clinically used. Agreed. And we could probably...
But I guess that's the beginning of awareness.
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's a great point too. So I suspect that this topic will continue into a conversation about trauma-informed care. And before you can get to trauma-informed care, there's trauma-aware care. So it's a spectrum. So trauma-aware really is kind of the starting point of do we know what it is? And so let's start there. What is trauma?
What is trauma?
Since we could go on and on about how we would define trauma, I'm going to use SAMHSA's definition, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration definition. And that states that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being.
Wow.
That was a mouthful. We can break it down.
That is such a comprehensive definition. I love that.
Yes. It is comprehensive. That's one of the reasons I love it too. I also love it is because it creates so much specificity in that as well. So I want to break it down because that very first, we can take this line by line. Individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. So let's pause there, comma. An event. Singular. Significant.
Yes.
So these are what we might call acute trauma in the clinical world. Maybe things like a car accident or an assault might fall into that singular event.
Maybe you survived a natural disaster.
Good example. The definition goes on. It could be a series of events. So it could be an ongoing thing, maybe like domestic violence.
Or child abuse.
Of course. The last one I really appreciate as well, because it's not so much about events as it is circumstance. So that could look like substance abuse in the home, substance use, or just instability or chaos in the home. So maybe it's not one individual thing that we can pinpoint of like, this was traumatic, but it's just a series of circumstances.
Or like a family maybe that has housing instability.
Absolutely.
And so you're moving from place to place, in and out of shelters. Maybe you live in a neighborhood that feels unsafe.
100%. Yeah. Neighborhood violence, community violence, or like war zones, like any of those things could fall into, and it's not necessarily a single event.
Yeah.
So that's the E. That's that. So the great thing about this definition is that it gives us the 3 E's of trauma. The first being event. Something happens, whether it's a single event, a series of events or other circumstances, something happens. The second E is experienced. It is experienced by an individual. The reason I like that second E is because we experience things differently.
Yes.
And what one person experiences as traumatic, somebody else might experience as adversity. So we don't get to define for other people what experience was traumatic for them.
Yes.
Right?
So when people say, and I see this online because I like to look at the comments because I don't know. Like, well, I went through this and I was fine. Well, that doesn't matter.
That doesn't matter.
That's how it affected you. But for someone else, they could have experienced.
And I've heard it put this way before: trauma overwhelms our ability to cope.
Yes.
So if it overwhelms my ability to cope, I experience it as traumatic. If it does not overwhelm your ability to cope, then you do not have to define it as traumatic, right? So I really appreciate that second E because it allows for perception, an individual experience. The last E of that definition is effects. So the first one is an event. Something happens. It is experienced by that individual as traumatic, and it has long-lasting adverse effects. And then the definition goes on to define those as mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. And I don't know that we always talk about those that comprehensive of a list when we talk about the effects. I think sometimes we focus on mental effects, or maybe even social effects. How often are we talking about the spiritual effects of trauma? Right?
I love that too. And we'll talk about this a little bit further into this conversation, but the long-term impact of trauma, just taking even one of those aspects, if you just look at the long-term mental health impact, it's huge. It's debilitating.
Oh, of course.
The physical impact, like, oh my God. So, like, I just want to be on the mountaintop and like everyone,
I know.
This should be required, like, a required class in school. Like
call me. I don't know what to say. Like I will happily talk about these things with anybody who wants to talk about them. So let's take those things one at a time. So let's talk through some mental effects.
Wait, before you do that, like, let's just review the 3 E's because that was new to me and I hadn't heard the 3. So we have an event. Something happens. Someone experienced it.
Yeah. So the experience is really that personal connection to it. So how did I experience it?
So there was an event, you experienced it, and then
effects.
The effect. How did it affect you?
Long-lasting effects. So maybe the effects were mental. Maybe it was depression. Maybe you're having feelings of anxiety now. Maybe you even have a clinical diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe you're having intrusive thoughts or flashbacks. All of those could kind of wrap up into some of the effects that we commonly see connected to mental functioning after trauma. Physical effects, I don't know that we always give as much attention to.
But these are huge.
Huge.
So if you think about trauma and the event is an ongoing kind of series. So it's not, it wasn't like one event and, like a car crash, one event, it happened and it's over. But let's say it's an ongoing thing. You live for a long time in an unsafe neighborhood, or you are in a home where you're witnessing domestic violence or something, it's ongoing.
Right.
So when you're experiencing trauma, that like sends you into like fight or flight mode.
Yes.
The stress on your body. So this is from the Cleveland Clinic. I am from Cleveland, so if I can cite them, but they have, just a great page here on trauma and ACEs, and which we'll talk about that in a second. But when you're experiencing stress, your body is releasing hormones, cortisol and adrenaline, to help you adjust to the situation. But your body is not designed to be at that level. Like long term,
marinating our brains in cortisol.
The cortisol, like that, raises your blood pressure. It can cause some memory issues. It increases your heart rate, and so if you're experiencing that long term,
right? Yeah, let's talk some more about like that cortisol and the adrenaline and what it does to our brains and our bodies. So, cortisol and adrenaline, not bad, needed. We need them in order to function, right? They help us in scary situations. However, like you said, our brains aren't meant to be saturated, right? Our brains and bodies are not meant to be at those elevated levels of cortisol for prolonged periods of time. So just an example of what might happen. So trauma impacts the physical structures of the brain. So just like take that in for a moment. Like it's literally changing the structure and the function of our brain. So the stress hormone cortisol can affect our hippocampus. So our hippocampus is a little seahorse-shaped structure in our brain, and it is involved in our memory processing. So how our memories are processed in our brain. Elevated levels of cortisol can shrink our hippocampus, literally shrink it. Now, the good news is our brains are resilient. They can recover once those cortisol levels go down. But it really, that's literally changing the structure by shrinking our hippocampus. You mentioned fight or flight. That's related to our amygdala. So our amygdala is our alarm center in our brain, ringing the fire alarm, danger, danger, threat. And when we experience trauma, our amygdala can become hyperactive. So then we're seeing instances of folks who have survived trauma being hypervigilant or having anxiety around situations. And then our prefrontal cortex. So listeners, if you're out there listening, one thing I like to do is I like to reference my prefrontal cortex when I'm doing this training. So if you want to take your palm and gently place it on your forehead, you are right about where your prefrontal cortex is in your brain. And that's the part of our brain responsible for logical thinking, decision-making, kind of the things that make us human, the prefrontal cortex, that's where that happens. And we know that high exposures to cortisol, high levels of cortisol can affect that thinking brain. They can alter the size and the connectivity of that prefrontal cortex, making it difficult to regulate our emotions, making it difficult to make decisions. So when we talk about the physical effects of trauma, there are physical impacts to the brain. And that's the brain. There are other ways that it impacts our physical health as well.
I feel like, to add another layer to this, the layperson, I feel like, probably thinks that like children under a certain age, because they can't verbalize what's happening, they probably won't remember what's happening if they're young enough. Like, what we know, because they've done studies on it, that for infants, they experience this trauma too. So an example of this could look like neglect. So the infant who maybe is hungry, upset for whatever reason, and no adult comes to comfort them, hold them, that lack of connection and having someone come offer support and comfort, and that creates some stress and trauma on infants, impacts their cognitive development.
Yeah.
And so, you see kids that come from hard circumstances, maybe there was abuse in the home or they lived in a violent neighborhood or whatever. And often those are the kids who go to school and they're struggling to learn how to read. They maybe are hitting milestones later, delayed. that is because of the trauma they experienced
Right.
in infancy.
Yeah.
So if you're thinking, well, my child is so young, they're not even going to remember this. That
Their bodies are. Our bodies are remembering.
The body keeps
the score.
Which is, we'll have to do a whole other episode on that. But the body remembers.
Mm-hmm. That's right. The body does remember. And so some other ways that we can see the effects of trauma show up physically: chronic pain, difficulty sleeping, chest pains, headaches. We'll get into ACEs in just a little bit, but there are so many different chronic conditions that have been linked to adverse childhood experiences. We keep abbreviating and calling it ACEs. They stand for adverse childhood experiences. I just want to keep going through the list of other ways that signs and symptoms of trauma. So the effects might be social, in that someone might avoid things that remind them of the traumatic experience, whether that is a person, a place, or a thing. So maybe they have cut off visiting a certain place, right? Whether that be a social connection group or, there just might be impacts there. Emotionally, it might look like changes in self-view, difficulty regulating emotions and behavior, impulse control. Then with spirituality, it's really interesting because it kind of, there's a spectrum of ways that this could show up. Maybe somebody starts questioning their spiritual beliefs because of the trauma they've experienced, or some folks turn to spirituality as a coping mechanism. So really just a wide array of what that might look like in terms of spiritual effects, but certainly something that we can get curious about and consider when we're thinking about trauma.
What I love about that is that it is addressing kind of the whole person. So the mental, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual. I mean, even if you're not a person of faith, we still have we're all spiritual beings on some level. We have a conscience. We have something that we believe in. And so that part of our personhood is impacted too.
Every single piece of our personhood is impacted. And then I do want us to talk about the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. I'm happy to give a background on that study. Do you want me to start with that? Is that a good place to start?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm like, tell me where to dive in, Charity.
How do ACEs...
Yeah.
What are ACEs and how do they play into this?
You got it. So adverse childhood experiences. This was a study in the 90s. And so what happened was an HMO in California and the CDC got curious about health outcomes they were seeing in adults. And so they studied the impact that adverse childhood experiences would have on somebody's health outcomes later in life. Now, they identified 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that somebody might experience throughout their lifetime. We know there are more than 10 possible traumatic experiences, but they looked at 10.
And quickly,
Go for it.
Let's list these: domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health condition, parental separation or divorce, incarceration, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect are the areas that the ACEs survey. And if you want to take that survey yourself, you can.
Yes.
Just Google ACEs survey, and you can find lots of different mental health, behavioral health sites where you can
it's available.
Get your own ACE score.
Right. And so what these researchers learned during this study was they would assign folks a score of 1 for every adverse childhood experience they had experienced. So for example, if somebody had experienced a household where domestic violence was present, then an ACE score of 1. If they experienced domestic violence and an incarcerated parent, a score of 2. So that just so on and so forth. And what they found was that the higher the ACE score, the more adverse childhood experiences somebody had, the higher the likelihood of some chronic conditions, things like diabetes, COPD, cardiovascular disease, stroke, substance use, all kinds of social and behavioral outcomes as well, more likely to have work performance issues. And then the one that really is jarring to me, that I think is probably what fuels my passion for this topic, is that an individual with an ACE score of 6 or higher has a life expectancy decrease of 20 years. So we're talking about 20 years off of somebody's life when they experience an ACE score of 6 or higher. To me, when you were saying this should be required learning, Yes. Like that's it for me. This is literally our health outcomes in life, all the way up to early death. We need to be minimally trauma aware, preferably trauma informed, but just minimally understand the very real physical, emotional, mental, psychological effects of trauma.
So I feel like this is the perfect time to add something else to this. So I went to a conference this summer and they talked about Philadelphia ACEs. So all the 10 areas that we mentioned earlier, and I have taken that ACEs survey and my score was kind of low and I'm like, but that didn't feel right. So the Philadelphia ACEs, and you can go to philadelphiaaces.org. It's its own nonprofit. And they did a study in the Philadelphia area, collecting a broader range of data. So they added a few questions to that ACEs survey that cover some things that poor folks and people of color, youth of color, are more likely to experience witnessing violence. So not necessarily in the home, but in your neighborhood, felt discrimination, adverse neighborhood experiences, being bullied, living in foster care. So they add a few questions to that. And so you can go to Philadelphia ACEs. If you want to take that survey, you can fill out the interest form and they'll send you a link to take the Philadelphia ACEs. When I took that ACEs survey, my score was a lot higher. But I feel like we can't talk about this without also talking about how strategically undervalued populations in our community experience much higher rates, let's say, of disease. So the Black community, their rates of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all of that stuff is higher. And I feel like, and I don't know that there's been a study done on this, but the collective trauma that
Absolutely.
the average Black person in America goes through, probably having adverse neighborhood experiences, witnessing violence, feeling discrimination, being bullied. Like, again, the body keeps the score.
Yes.
So even you might just say like, oh, some kids called me names and slurs when I was in school, but it didn't really bother me. The body keeps the score.
And if you are interested in historical trauma, generational trauma, racial trauma, there's a phenomenal book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, and it's incredible, all about generational trauma and how it's linked to racial trauma. Yeah. So, Charity, part of what you were talking about is we have to consider that generational piece of it. The CDC's pyramid around the adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, the bottom of that pyramid is historical trauma and generational embodiment. Before we even get to the ACEs, so just if you want to Google this later, it's the CDC's ACE study pyramid. And so it starts with generational embodiment and historical trauma. It moves up to social conditions and local context, like what you were saying about neighborhoods and violence in neighborhoods. And then the next step in the pyramid is adverse childhood experiences. So before we are even born, before we even experience the adverse childhood experience, there are things in the mix that are happening around our experience around trauma.
I think that's also a really good point. Because even before we're born, so the woman who's pregnant, experiencing stress and trauma, and that cortisol and adrenaline coursing and through her body is impacting that unborn child. Okay.
I know. And then if we want to get really deep dive, and if that child is female and carrying reproductive organs, that will lead to it's generational. Okay.
I feel like another example of this, I think about the kids who like we're young during the pandemic, like elementary age kids. I feel like there's going to be some generational trauma there of like being in lockdown, not having the social connections that they were used to, like life being so different. We don't yet know. I think, and really for all of us, like, because that whole period was really traumatic for a lot of folks. Yeah. We don't know what the impact of that is going to be yet.
Yeah, but so
it is
curious.
Going.
Oh yeah, there will be something. Yeah,
I think just anecdotally hearing from teachers talking about some of those students, like it's those students who maybe, let's say, were elementary aged, and so now they're in junior high or high school. Like they are coming without a lot of the social. So just the social impact, a lot of the social awareness and maturity, because they weren't having those experiences because they were locked down at home.
It'll be really interesting to see what those, because I'm with you. We're not far enough out yet to probably have that research to the breadth that we will one day.
Yeah.
Anecdotally as well, from a kid's perspective, I had a colleague tell me that they were talking to their kiddo saying, "Oh, are you excited for spring break in 2022 maybe?" And they said, "No." And because the last time they had spring break, they didn't come back to school. Like spring break was the last time that they got released before the lockdown or the shutdown. And so, so just having negative experiences around what spring break means. And in my mind, spring break is full of, fun and vacation and sunshine. And for them, it was, that was the last week of normalcy before my world totally changed.
So, this is a local podcast primarily, but I can't help but think about youth around the world, like in war-torn areas, like that, even if they haven't, maybe they have been fortunate enough to escape any physical harm, and maybe they still have all of their family members. I feel like depending on the war-torn area we're talking about, that may be slim, but the trauma, the impact that trauma is going to have. And so I feel like this leads to kind of the next point, is that our society, we want to write people off. Like, oh, they're, that kid has behavior issues. Oh, they're making really risky choices over here. Why are they doing that? When you have experienced that trauma that's impacting you cognitively, like actually changing your brain, I think it's going to be really difficult to then make what might seem like rational decisions, because you were still in that fight or flight mode, even when you have come out of that experience.
Right.
And if it's impacted your brain, you may not even have the capability, really, especially if you're a young person, of making safer, more logical decisions. And so often what we're seeing that we're writing off as bad behavior is really the impact of trauma. And so I love kind of the shorthand that I hear so often with trauma is it's not about what's wrong with you, but what happened.
Yeah. Right. 100%. And I'm eager to get into that conversation into our next episode about trauma-informed practices and really shifting the lens. I have pulled up a quote from Dr. Bruce Perry, who does a lot of trauma research. And the quote is, "So I'm not crazy. No, your brain is doing exactly what you would expect it to do, considering what you lived through. You are having a really reasonable response to an unreasonable situation." Right. And I would be, I've got to do my due diligence here as well. I think that because we are a domestic violence shelter who employs so many helping professions, I have to take a moment to talk about vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is experienced secondhand to the trauma itself. So for example, if you are a helping professional and you are working with folks who are experiencing trauma, such as domestic violence, or if you're a healthcare worker, or if you are a mental health professional, right? If you're in any of those helping professions, you could be experiencing vicarious trauma. And what's interesting is the signs and symptoms that we see with folks experience vicarious trauma look very similar to the signs and symptoms of trauma that we see for folks firsthand experiencing that. So it's not uncommon for folks in these helping professions to have things like nightmares or hypervigilance, sleep problems, anger, anxiety, depression, or apathy. Sometimes we call it compassion fatigue or empathic distress. When we get to the point where we know we're supposed to care, but something's just not clicking. The empathy is just not there for whatever reason. Really good indicator that we are experiencing some compassion fatigue because of vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
And so we as systems, so now we're really, I mean, how much longer can we make this podcast? Because now we as systems have got to be protecting people and recognizing that we can expect vicarious trauma if we are working in a field that is just all about helping those who experience trauma. We as the system have to be prepared to care for our folks.
I feel like this is just another soapbox, but I am always so taken aback by employers in those helping fields who are so awful to their staff.
You know,
and it's like, how are you, if you are awful to your staff? So let's say you're a nonprofit working with, victims of violence or whatever, and you're awful to your staff. And so now they're dealing with that. And then they're supposed to go out and be their best self.
Not going to happen.
Work with their clients who, because, then they're also experiencing the vicarious trauma from that. Like,
I know. No, it compounds.
We have to do better.
We have to do better. We have to, and that's what comes to mind when I think I'm going to try and take, a Maya Angelou approach here. We know better, we do better. And it's not necessarily, I think, that systems are aiming to be awful or unhelpful to their staff, but I do think that we inherit systems. And when we inherit a system that places a lot of emphasis on productivity or places, in the for-profit sector, an emphasis on capitalism or whatever it might be, like those are systems that we're inheriting. And it's going to take us challenging that worldview to really say, how do we care best for our people? One more thing I want to say, and then we can take a break. But I just want you to know that a lot of times this conversation can sound really heavy, and that's because it is, right? These are serious things that we're talking about, and there's hope. So if you're sitting there going, yeah, I've taken my ACEs score. I have a really high ACEs score. Well, the really good news is that our brains can experience something called neuroplasticity, which means our brains can change and adapt throughout our lifetimes. So there's hope for us. So if we were that 3-year-old who experienced abuse or neglect or whatever it might be, it does not mean that we have to experience those effects later in life, right? Because there's hope and there's healing. We heal best through connection with others. So please reach out to those helping professionals, reach out to those domestic violence shelters, those crisis centers, those hotlines, whoever can best assist you with your needs. Please reach out and know that there are healing relationships available, whether that look like behavioral health services or advocacy. I just want you to know, if you're struggling, if you've experienced trauma, just know that there's hope.
I'd like to add just a couple of notes before we wrap up this conversation. So there is something called PACEs, which is protective and compensatory experiences. So you kind of just touched on this, Kirstyn, with the brain plasticity. So you can counteract the impact of that trauma with positive experiences. So that could look like getting mental health support, finding a good therapist to help work through some issues. It could look like being intentional and making time to spend time with people that you care about and trust and are safe. So getting together with those people, connecting Those social connections are so important. It could be getting into activities that you enjoy. Maybe you really enjoy getting outside and taking a walk in nature, or making things with your hands. And so having those positive experiences can counteract, can kind of undo the damage. We just have to be intentional about them. And I'll say one more thing, and this came from my own therapist. When you've been through stuff, sometimes I feel like part of the effect of that is that you're just really down on yourself, like, but you made the best choices that you could with what you had, the resources that you had at the time.
That's right.
And so sometimes, and I myself included, like, we can have regret, like, why didn't I do this differently or better? Why didn't you did the best you could? And I feel like this is also a way to help understand, maybe if you were a young person and the adults around you were not the people they needed to be. Well, they had their own trauma, and that's been helpful to me, recognizing that because they had trauma, like, they also, not to excuse any bad behavior, but they were doing the best they could
as well
with what they had. And they may not have had very many tools. They were doing the best. So give yourself some grace.
Well said.
And find those things that make you feel good. Be around the people that make you feel good.
And we'll just have to title this episode "And One More Thing," because apparently once you get us started talking about trauma, we've got more to say. Speaking of more to say, we're gonna do another episode on trauma.
If you too have a trauma soapbox and you want to learn more about this issue, come back for the next episode where we'll talk about trauma-informed care. What does it look like to actually help people, support them after that? So come back for more. Kirstyn, this was an amazing conversation, and I love that we shared this soapbox.
Thanks, Charity.
All individuals have a right to a life free of abuse. If you or someone you know needs help, please call our 24-hour hotline, 417-864-SAFE, 417-864-7233, or chat 24/7 with an advocate on our website at myharmonyhouse.org. Visit our website or follow us on our socials to stay up on the latest news and events. This is Voices Against Violence. Thanks for listening.